So our session title is How to Live a Very, Very Long Time, but also how the shifts in the priorities in the last 12 months, and obviously particularly borne out by the COVID-19 epidemic that we're all living through at the moment. So I have three fantastic panelists, but before I introduce them, just a quick word. I know our three panelists through a lot of the work that has been taking place over the last sort of 12 months to do with the APPG for longevity that I run, and in particular the Health of the Nation strategy that was launched in February. And we focus a lot, obviously, on how we can all live a longer, healthier life, 5 extra years of healthy life expectancy while minimizing health inequalities, which is a government commitment, a government manifesto commitment. But as we've been living through COVID, of course, what it has thrown up in horrific detail is how those who are in the poorest health, those who are most deprived, those who are most vulnerable are those, of course, who have been impacted most by the epidemic. So that has spawned and created a huge frenzy of incredible scientific research and activity, which one of our panelists will describe. So I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists, and I'll just very quickly introduce them in turn. So our first panelist is Professor Andrew Scott, who is the Professor of Economics at the London Business School. Now, I know Andrew because and know him through his first book that he wrote called The 100-Year Life. He has now just written a book called The New Long Life, which is, as you can see on the screens here, it is out. It is a wonderful book. And he very much inspired certainly my thinking and how we manage our longer life for myself personally, and I know for many, many other people. He also has written the foreword, and I'm very grateful to him for my own book. So thank you so much, Andrew, for coming. Now, our next panelist is Lynne Cox, who is a biogerontologist and principal investigator for the Lab of Aging and Cell Senescence at Oxford. Now, I know Lynne, and I've gotten to know Lynne quite well. She is on the strategic advisory board for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Longevity, and has provided immense insight and knowledge in the whole field and the science of aging. So really, really pleased that she's here with us today. And finally, very, very happy to introduce Professor Nick Palmarini, who is just taking up the directorship of the National Innovation Centre for Aging Intelligence at Newcastle. Incredible organization that is going to be doing incredible things, particularly around humanity and ethics, which Nick will describe. And I actually interviewed Nick while he was still at IBM for my book. So really, really pleased that Nick is here. And he has his own story to tell about COVID as well, as we all do. In fact, that might be one of the questions that I ask you. So without further ado, the format will be, each of our panelists will come on for up to about 5 minutes. I'll ask a question or two. So for all of those who are listening and viewing, please do send your questions. I will try and get through all the questions. So we'll go in turn, and then hopefully have enough time sort of for an interactive sort of free-form discussion before we close at 1:45. So, Andrew.
Including aging, and I have to say, for me, I think it's interesting how little we focus on the aging topic. It may seem strange in a year when life expectancy is going to decline because of COVID to be talking about longevity, but I think in a way it intensifies the issue rather than minimizes it. COVID is an accelerant. It's bringing forward many trends like technology. How do we work and live and balance work and home, and who can use technology to still work is something we're all getting to grips with. It's also a stress test. It's revealing many, many weaknesses, particularly I think around an aging society. And I think what's extraordinary about COVID is two factors. The first is this is the first pandemic we've had since the world's population has been, the population aged over 65 is greater than those under 5. And that has very much changed the way we've responded to this pandemic, and more on that later. The other thing is, if you look at the fatality rate of COVID, it kind of mimics the general causes of all sources of death. It's like a sort of viral infection of aging. So it's intensified the issue of aging. The stats are quite extraordinary. You look at England and Wales, only 0.7% of the deaths have been people under 40, and that's 50% of the population. But 82% of the deaths have been people aged over 70, which makes up 12.5% of the population. The average age of people dying is 80. And I was looking at some Deutsche Bank numbers today, and they were looking at Pennsylvania, where more people have died of COVID over 100 than under 45. So this is the sort of viral increase in aging. And of course, at the heart of the policy dilemma is how do we keep a population healthy and an economy that's healthy in the presence of an aging society. So this is absolutely all about what we need to deal with longevity and aging society. So it's a stress test around those factors. Now, I want to look very quickly at three factors: a statistical factor, what's going to happen to life expectancy because of COVID. I'll offer some thoughts about the medical and scientific side, although there are others on this panel far better suited than I for that. And then thirdly, I'll look at the economic and social. As an economist, they're the ones that interest me the most. So let me start with the statistics. I'm often asked what's going to happen to life expectancy. And, it's going to vary enormously across countries, because in Hong Kong, we've seen 4 people die from COVID. And I mention Hong Kong because they define best practice life expectancy. They currently have the highest average life expectancy at birth. So if they've only had 4 deaths, their life expectancy is hardly going to change at all. But clearly in the UK and US, we're going to see significant falls in life expectancy for 2020. Who knows, 5 or 6 years are some of the estimates that I've been seeing. I think that's kind of really important, because it's revealing that some societies are capable of looking after older people and others aren't. And the tragedy in social care homes you're seeing in so many countries is a proof point of that. The other thing is, if you think about the life expectancy of a newborn, I'm not sure COVID has any long-term implications for that. Who knows if we will or won't get a vaccine, but a newborn today has a long time before they get old. And I think whatever your initial optimism was around life expectancy or pessimism, there's no reason why it should be changed. But I do want to come back to this difference in across countries in life expectancy, which is going to get amplified this year. And I do think that we've got to start to focus much more upon life expectancy as a measure of government success and not just GDP. And again, just think what's happened. We have accepted these huge falls in GDP this year in order to preserve life. And that's kind of a policy choice. So clearly, we value life more than GDP. So putting that as a more central target, I think, is really important. Just one other footnote on the statistics. Those of you know the statistics, know there's different ways of measuring life expectancy, period versus cohort. The period one assumes that you just use this year's mortality rates. They're going to show very big falls in life expectancy. But the cohort measures are those that reflect, say, a child born today, what's going to happen over their lifetime. That should fall much less. So we're going to see a lot of misleading statistics, I think, because of that. I'll quickly move on to the medical and the scientific side. People like Lynne are working very hard, and I think absolutely rightly, on trying to treat and slow down how we age, rather than looking at single diseases. Hey, we've got another disease that is linked to age. So the value of slowing down aging becomes all the more apparent. And my reading of the literature on COVID is that it's not just working through comorbidities in age, there's something about aging itself. And then the other, I think, very good thing around we're seeing is a big focus on preventative health. The whole point of lockdown is to try and keep people out of hospital and keep them healthy, which of course is exactly the shift that we want to make. We want to stop our health system being overrun by ill older people taking up beds. And that is what we're trying to achieve in lockdown. But I think we're starting to see a bit of a shift in terms of how people use AI, for instance. The team will be interested in that, consult with hospitals, etc. And then let me just very briefly move on to the social implications of all of this. So I've got a big ESRC grant trying to find the economics of a longevity dividend. If we're living longer and are healthier for longer, then the economy should benefit from that. But I do fear that the biggest implication of COVID is going to be that people's finances will be harder hit than their life expectancy. And many people in their 50s are going to lose a job and find it very hard to get another one. So the agenda of trying to help people work for longer is being set back by COVID. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. If the preventative health agenda has been advanced by COVID, I fear that the longevity dividend has been set back. But then I just want to try and, sorry, forgive my cat in the background. I thought it was somewhere else. Apparently living long, you need a pet. So there we go. That's one of the things I'm doing. There's 2 other things I think are important. We've heard a lot about bending the curve, pushing back the spread of COVID. Well, there's 2 curves we need to push back. One is our health and how we age, which Lynne will talk about later. But also what this crisis has revealed is just huge inequities in how we age. We're seeing low income and certain ethnic groups have much, much higher fatality rates, which they do anyway. And if we're really thinking about cratering the economy to save lives, then we've got to think, well, why don't we tackle those inequalities? So, for instance, in the US, there are deaths of despair from opiates and suicides, etc. That was 160,000 people in 2017. died deaths of despair. Well, given the GDP impact we're prepared to take to save lives this time, we need to be consistent in our decision making and say, well, let's really tackle those inequities. So just two closing statements. Unfortunately, the economy is going to have lower growth and higher government debt. And that's going to make the whole aging society story more difficult because there's fewer resources, but it will increase the urgency of tackling something. But what I do think is really interesting in all of this is, as a society, we have shown that we are prepared to accept, in the case of the UK, the biggest recession for more than 300 years in order to save lives, and the lives mainly of older people. There's lots of discussion that we don't value old people, we don't care about aging, but I can't think of a more dramatic way of proving that we do care. And going back to that consistency of purpose, this just shows how important it is to make sure that those lives remain long and healthy, which of course is what we're trying to do with Shutdown. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Fantastic scene setting, and also raised some really interesting questions and also some thoughts, particularly learning from how other countries have been responding to COVID. But just to ask you a specific question, and that I know has come up in some of the Health of the Nation work and the roundtables that we held recently about this. You touched on it in your talk just now, but this whole notion of primacy of well-being over GDP, and of course, you know, what the government are doing now is quite extraordinary. We've also heard quite a lot about what New Zealand are doing, and of course, Jacinda Ardern, who now has 0 deaths or 0, they've basically gotten rid of COVID in New Zealand. She's been kind of called out as a model of, you know, best example, and also for their well-being index. Any comments on that? Because I know we're looking at this idea of the index in a variety of different ways, as a business index, but also as a well-being index, which was mentioned in the Prevention Green Paper, for example. Is this something that we should really, really look at seriously, do you think?
100%. I mean, let me tell you a little bit about some of the research I'm doing. It's all the danger of asking an academic. But I'm trying to do, there's a literature in economics called the value of statistical life, which is used to assess government's expenditure on safety measures. And I'm trying to use that to value the gains to life expectancy versus healthy life expectancy, etc. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the US numbers, the value of a statistical life is $11.5 million, which is way more than any money you'll earn over your life. You know, one of the little known secrets of economics is the things we value the most aren't found in GDP. Now, in normal times, GDP is a pretty good measure of the standard of living. I think both because COVID is not normal times, we're obviously saying, well, let's crater the economy to save lives, and that's a good thing. But also managing the anxiety that comes with COVID is also a very key welfare indicator. And that's not included in GDP. And of course, if we go further ahead and think about technology and AI, we're going to have to also, I think, move away from GDP, because AI is going to cause a lot of disruption and transitions in the labour market. And even though GDP may be increasing, we may be suffering a lot of anxiety and social displacement. So I'd say, as an economist, I have no worries that the things we value most in life are not the things that are found in GDP.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in greater detail in both the next sessions. So thank you, Andrew. Lynne, over to you. Tell us what you've been up to.
Thanks, Tina. Okay, well, Andrew, thank you so much for setting the scene. One of the starting points, obviously, for any conversation now is that aging is the biggest risk factor for both severe disease and death from COVID. So we need to understand what's going on and what makes older people different, if you like, from younger people. So can we understand the biological basis behind aging? And we know from lots of research that biological aging is a fundamental change to the cells and the tissues and the organs that make up our bodies. And the overall effect of that is a loss of homeostasis or physiological resilience. So that's the inability to return back to a state of normal after disruption or stress. So what leads to this loss of resilience? Well, we know that cells can become damaged over time, just chronological time, but also how many times the cells divide. Or they can get damaged through chemicals, either things from our environment or even from cellular processes, things that are happening within the cells themselves. And the damage can drive cells into a state known as cell senescence. And it happens faster in tissues and organs where you have very high rates of cell turnover. So the lining of the digestive tract, the blood vessels, the bone, and particularly the skin. And I think as we go through life, we start to notice that in ourselves. And senescent cell numbers go up as we age, and they go up faster in people with premature aging syndrome. We know that they're causative in a lot of age-related diseases because if you inject senescent cells into young mice, their health deteriorates, they get various diseases associated with aging prematurely. And importantly, when you remove those cells from middle-aged mice, you can actually improve their health. So we know that senescent cells are responsible for a lot of ill health and diseases associated with aging. And that in the field has led to development of a lot of drugs, a whole variety of different approaches to try and kill senescent cells. And some of those are in phase 1 and phase 2 trials for age-related diseases, including osteoarthritis, diabetic kidney disease, Alzheimer's, and lung fibrosis. And I think this is a space where we'll see a lot more development quite quickly. Now, what my lab has been doing over the past few years is studying how cells change as they undergo senescence at the molecular level. And so to do this, it's a long drawn out process. So we've been growing cells in the lab now for months and years until they become senescent. And essentially playing a game of molecular spot the difference. So what's different in a young cell from a middle-aged cell from an old cell? And trying to identify factors that change that might drive the aging process. And obviously with the hope of them being able to identify targets potentially for drugging where we can overcome those drivers and push cells towards a more useful behavior. So essentially either delaying or turning back the biological clock. Now, one target has come out of our research and that of many, many other labs. It's been known for years to be important in aging and it just popped out of our screen. So we thought we're along the right track. And it's called mTOR. And mTOR is a protein complex that's inhibited by a drug called rapamycin. And when you feed rapamycin to mice, they live longer. So it's obviously got a major role in the aging process, but not just in aging, but in disease. So Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease in mice are improved by treatment with this drug. And Matt Koberlein in the States has got a study with companion dogs, with pet animals, showing that heart health is improved with rapamycin. Now, there's a new clinical trial that has reported improved skin appearance and structure using rapamycin in a skin cream. So a lot of people might be interested in that. We've actually been testing a second generation mTOR inhibitor, so a drug that acts on mTOR but works in a slightly different way from rapamycin. And excitingly, we've shown that we can actually make old cells, the ones just before they've committed to the point of senescence, behave a lot more like younger cells. So we can restore their appearance and their behavior, and most importantly, the molecular composition back to that you'd expect in a much younger cell. So these drugs have significant potential to actually improve health in later life. I have to emphasize that those are actually our work still at the lab bench and not yet in the clinic. But anti-aging drugs are incredibly relevant right now in a world of COVID. As Andrew has already pointed out, the people most badly hit by COVID are those who are older. 90% of deaths in hospitals in the UK are those aged over 60. And if you look at the fold increase in deaths, 52 times more people over 60 died than those under 60. And if you look at the over 80s, more than 200 times more people died, even though they represent a much smaller tranche of the population. And the tragedy in care homes in the UK and across the world are only just coming to light. Now, one of the reasons that older people are much more at risk is that their immune system gradually deteriorates as well as all of us get older, and that's called immune senescence. And there are three important arms to the immune system. So first of all, physical barriers like the skin or the lining of the respiratory tract. Also, a fairly evolutionary ancient process, evolutionary conserved ancient process called innate immunity. And then the much slower but much more precise targeted immunity that we all know about with antibodies, B and T cells. And remarkably, COVID actually recapitulates many of the features of immunosenescence. So if you start off already immune compromised, COVID's got a head start. It's going to take out your immune system much more quickly. So what can geroscience bring to this? Well, perhaps the most important data we have in the field come from Joan Manick at Restore Bio, a company in the States. They've carried out, prior to COVID, phase 2B and phase 3 clinical trials with an mTOR inhibitor. And they showed that there was a reduced incidence and severity of respiratory tract infections, including coronaviruses then circulating at the time. As I say, this is pre-COVID. And they also showed, very importantly, that in severe infections, inhibiting mTOR actually decreased the time to recovery, so improved people's health much more quickly. And we know that that's acting through the immune system in two different ways. So it's supporting the innate immune system and it's supporting the adaptive immune system. So Joan has very recently received approval in the States for a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial for the drug RTB101 in nursing homes to protect vulnerable elderly people in a home where there are already confirmed cases. So to try and use it in advance of people getting infected or those who are at risk of being exposed. We've been collaborating with Joan Manick on this, and we've written some clinical trials in the UK as well, and we're just waiting to hear now for a funding decision from the NIHR. But as we move forwards and we look towards vaccines as well as drugs, we also have to remember that vaccines work in people who've got a functioning immune system. And of course, that's not the case in a lot of older people. So we really have to take immunosenescence into account. And so using drugs that are geroprotectors, things that can actually help either delay or ameliorate the aging process, might be incredibly beneficial when we're looking at vaccinating the elderly population so that they can actually live full and socially active lives. We do not want to live in a world where older people are told to shield forever. So what we need right now is to be able to build up health resilience across the population. Obviously, my research is in aging, but Andrew very cogently pointed out all the other risk factors, the socioeconomic risk factors. There are risk factors associated with the type of occupation, social deprivation, and race is also important. We have seen terrible statistics from BAME population members who are at so much more risk. And it may well be socioeconomic, but there are also some studies suggesting that there are differences in immune responses that we really need to take seriously. And there needs to be more investment and more science, and not shying away from difference and actually helping people to overcome this horrible disease. So all I'll finish with, I think it's incredibly important that we all pull together to promote health resilience, rather than simply treating diseases when we have them, but actually help the population to acquire that resilience as we all age. So that's probably all I'm going to say, Tina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynne. And, you know, I think the extraordinary progress we've seen in weeks rather than years is quite astonishing. It just shows the level of scientific collaboration going on around the world. And I also think the point that you make about resilience, I mean, it's fascinating, these concepts of personal resilience, community resilience, building up to national health resilience are some of the ideas that we're also looking at in the all-party parliamentary group work. But just, I see a couple of questions coming through. I'm going to ask you one question, say one for later. It asks, you can also turn off mTOR with a ketogenic diet. Why not do that, which has a lot of other benefits, such as autophagy, rather than using a drug with side effects? Can you answer that?
There are a lot of issues with people's diets. So ketogenic diets are diets that essentially push your metabolism towards using fats rather than sugars. And we do know that an excess of carbohydrates is actually potentially a cause of premature aging. So we have changes in our cells and proteins even on the outside of cells called glycation that's driven by high sugar. And that's driven faster in diabetes because of the lack of regulation of blood sugar. So people with diabetes essentially are suffering from premature aging. And of course, they also are badly hit by COVID. A ketogenic diet can be beneficial. It's used a lot in children with epilepsy, but there are some issues. We don't have long-term safety data on people shifting to a high-fat diet rather than a standard, what we would term a balanced diet. So I would just urge caution. I know a lot of people are trying it and they're saying it is beneficial and they're feeling that it works for them. I wouldn't prescribe it yet. I would say watch this space, but there is some scientific evidence that at least some aspects of it are beneficial.
Fantastic, thank you, Lynne. There's another question on fasting and on the amount, but we'll park that for later, just for now, because I just want to make sure that Nick has a chance. So Nick, so thank you so much, Lynne. So Nick, over to you and all the wonderful work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Thanks everyone for attending. So you put the question of the topic about today. It's about how to live a long life at the time of COVID. So I was trying to follow with some points that I guess are coming from the experience and also from the lesson taught by Andrew and Lynne that I am following obviously as much as you, Tina. So the first one, in my opinion, to live a long, long life is just to add intelligence to this life. We need to know more about what is already existing from the experience of all of us today. And I guess today is exactly the example that I think we should have to share as much as we can. But I think moreover, we should have to share the most powerful and unknown source of intelligence that we have available, which is the one of the older adults. It is time, I guess, we harness the capital locked in the life of older adults and make it available to others. At the center that I'm leading now, we basically have framed this whole approach. We named it Aging Intelligence and we trademarked it because we think it's time that we are able to harness this intelligence, transform it in data and make it available to others. My second point, I guess, and this is a lesson I learned from Andrew, there are no thrown away years. The 2020 is not a year thrown away because of COVID. And I remember Andrew, it was probably 6 months ago in London, when he was talking about the fact that the 70 years of today are not like the 60 years of yesterday. The 70 years of today are the 75 years of today. And why that? Because those 10 years of experience are those that make the difference. So I think it's important that this year is not a thrown away year. We're learning a lot from this year, even from ourselves. The third point I say is stay connected or stay totally disconnected. Because I guess the risk is that to be connected is listening to someone telling you are vulnerable or disposable just because of your age. We have witnessed the tangible demonstration of what ageism means and how it is perpetrated primarily through the media and communication, and how it's necessary today to start again precisely from the language to change this narrative. We have to reframe a narrative that I guess the COVID showed us how much ageist it is. A suggestion coming from Italy, do not go in assisted facility in Lombardia in Italy. And unfortunately, this is something that also happened heavily here in UK. The carnage that we assisted in the aging assisting facilities, I think proved that we have to completely redesign the experience of care as we knew it. I think it's a good suggestion, if possible, to be a woman. I think it's not a matter of life expectation since women are living longer than men, but I guess all the narrative that is popping up in terms of solutions is mainly driven by men. While you mentioned before, you see what happened in New Zealand, the country is led by a woman and they've done a lot better than others. So I think we have to start thinking the future also from a diversity perspective. There is an old recipe that it's be focused, have a mission, have a purpose in life. So one thing that I have to put back again on the table is about keep on working. We have done a research with the community that we're connected with at the National Innovation Center, and it became clear that people wanted, regardless of the economic necessity or not, to work, to help change the society by working, to stay connected to the other, to contribute to what's happening. So the point is, it's too bad that there are no plausible offers for those in the most advanced stages of their life. So the point is that we also have to reinvent the system of work that should allow people to bring and bring their experience to the work market. I think it's time to learn. I guess we can reinvent the educational process and unhinge from some paradigms, like if you're over 60, you can only enter university of the third age. I think there must be something different. Someone who have done a very good job is the LaSalle Village in Massachusetts, where basically people is allowed literally to study whatever topic with other students. So with students of whatever age, and not frame them in a sort of a ghetto just because of your age. I think there are examples there going on in Newcastle at the university. We're just exploring how it could be far more inclusive, no matter the age, to all our educational offering. One rule to keep in mind is that good design is good business. And it's easy to say with the words of Don Norman, old people are cool, design for them sucks. And I think there is everything that yet to be done in the field of designing properly solutions, business models, objects for, let me say, an ageless population. So it's time that we bring back design as a core principle. And I'm not talking only about the design thinking, which is such a popular way of extracting knowledge, but literally how we can design the things and the processes. This is related to one point, which I guess is important to remind. When we're designing for older adults, we're not only designing for them. So life is made of social interactions. So we have to think how what we're designing for certain generation is affecting the others and vice versa. And finally, knowledge will power new solution. You have wrote a beautiful book. You have written a beautiful book, Tina, and I think it's the core point, how much all the innovation coming from the different stages of AI, which is important to remind that it's not only one stage, it's not machine taking over tomorrow morning. We are in a stage of what we call narrow AI, which is very good in doing one thing. We're hardly reaching what it's called broad AI, so allowing machine to do something more complex than simply one specific process. And we have this, narrative about the so-called general AI that stands pretty far away to be achieved. It's a long path to get there. So there's a lot of steps to get there. But for sure, there is one thing that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with data and the population in general, furthermore, an aging population, which is the ethics of AI. We have to aim to a trusted AI. We have to do it today, now, which is fair, which is explainable, which is robust, which are sure that the process could be understood and managed by the people. Because the risk is that other way that we can give all the power to data and how data are processed without keeping quote unquote this power, which leads me to the last point. I think it's time that we can take advantage of our own data, and probably we can start thinking about how we can use data as a community and not as an individual. Because if we join as a community, we can provide the data and have a sort of a control and dealing powers towards who's handling our data.
Thank you so much, Nick. Fantastic. You've touched on so many sort of important topics, a huge amount. I mean, everything that you've said about design, and also your point about sort of ageism, and that notion of agelessness, which actually came out as a core kind of value in some of the work that we did last month, is really, really striking, and how we need to think, of people as people first, now going back, there's a few questions that are coming through on the chats, but just very, very quickly on the data point, just because this is an AI festival, of course. So Nick, data as a community, you've mentioned, of course, that's feeding into your whole concept for, obviously the National Institute for Aging Intelligence. How can we use data for good in a way that will solve, and I'm going to go to a point that was made actually with one of our viewers about some of these big issues that are coming out, the moral, ethical, environmental issues from COVID. How can we harness data for good that will really solve, I guess, some of the big societal issues of our time that are coming through as a result of COVID?
Yeah, two quick examples. First one, we can use natural language processing to understand if news are fake, because we can use the same tools that are generating fake news to spot if they're fake news. So you can literally use the same technique that sometimes AI use to generate a misunderstanding in spotting that misunderstanding. This is one example. The other one is just the idea of the big brother somehow. So the more data we can collect from our environment, things about the Internet of Things, for example, which obviously has a lot of implication for the older adults living their daily life. So if we can get some of this data, we can know more about the behavioral footprint of an individual, and then we can somehow understand and predict events to happen, which obviously puts the concept of the so-called big brother observing us. But what if instead of having this data shared straight away from an individual to a corporation, we aggregate this data as a neighborhood, for example. So it's a neighborhood which is owning this data. And instead of giving straight away this data from me to an entity, I'm giving to a central entity which is keeping this data and then dealing what to share, how to share, when to share, and what getting in exchange if I'm sharing this data, which I think is leading us to the idea of decentralized data. so that these data can be managed by users as individual, or even better, as a community.
So that's an interesting point, because one of the interesting themes that have come out through some of our recent work is this concept of decentralized health resilience. So building from individual to communities, and that you create the national resilience. And that, of course, introduces a whole bunch of thinking around data models fit for the future, etc. So very interesting. Now, I'm just conscious we've only got about almost 10 minutes left if they let us go a little bit over time, which they may not. But I just want to pick up on the point. There's quite a lot of questions coming on diet and so forth and aging, which I'm going to let Lynne answer in a moment. But just some of the bigger stuff around the environment and social issues that have been really coming out as a result of COVID. Now, Andrew, you often talk about the longevity dividend. What do you mean by that, and how should we think about it moving forward, and how can we perhaps measure it? For example, knowing that the National Innovation Centre for Aging Intelligence is there harnessing all this data. Is there a way that we can measure the longevity dividend, maybe tied in with the wellbeing index, for example? Sorry, I'm thinking aloud here.
No, absolutely. I mean, so I think I'm going to look at two ways of answering it. One, I'll just put on my macroeconomist hat, which is that we're living longer, healthier lives, which should be good for the economy because we can be productive for longer. And that's going to be really important. And by productive, I mean purely in an economic sense. There's a broader sense of we can also have a meaningful life. And so they should be good for the economy. We hear all this, there's a lot of focus about an aging society, there being more old people. But this whole longevity agenda is about how our aging is changing. And that's happened because of all sorts of public health measures, changes in our diet and medical interventions. And then there's maybe even more coming. So how do we maximize that improvement in how we age and make good benefits from it? And so economics tends not to look at this subject. We just tend to look at an aging society. There's more old people. But of course, longevity is a very multi-dimensional concept. So what are the key levers of policy which would help us unleash this dividend? So, for instance, if we just push back retirement to happen later, I don't think that's a very good idea, because we just extend working careers, it's pretty miserable. And if we don't increase our education, we're not going to get much of a longevity dividend. So we need to just investigate, as we do with technology, neither technology nor demography are destiny. How we shape them is up to us. Then, of course, if we do have this longer life, and this, you kindly mentioned my new book, The New Long Life, which is looking at technology and longevity together. There's a lot of pessimism around, which I totally get, because right now we're on a dystopian path. And I'll come back to sort of how COVID is feeding into that. But if we step back, we've got this smart new technology that can do wonderful things, and machines are going to be more machine-like. That gives us the scope to be more human-like. To redefine work and redefine life to make more of our human capacity. And then if we do have more time and it's healthy, then that's a great thing. I don't know why at the end of the day says, oh yeah, I had too much time today. I just don't know what to do with myself. By and large, we want more time. So these are two huge opportunities to be seized. Now that's terribly positive on the long run, but we've got to start a narrative about what we want from this. Now I'm moving away from the economics now to a social narrative. And what is absolutely key is we don't let this narrative get pinned down by companies or even governments. It's up for us to decide what to do. I think society is going through a massive transformation with new technologies and longevity. Our existing social and economic institutions don't work. And you can see that because we're getting frayed and we're seeing growing inequality and growing tensions. We need two things for a healthy society. We need everyone to feel they're getting some benefit from the economy, and we need everyone to feel they've got a voice in the political process. And what we're going to make sure is that that actually happens, and then together we can then make sure we get the most of technology and of longevity. COVID is a terrible experience, but it's exposing all the challenges and weaknesses we've got. And I hope it's going to start a social narrative that says, actually, we can't rely upon governments, we can't rely upon companies. It's community and people we need to focus on.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree with you more. It has to come from all of us, the citizen, at the heart of it. And I think this is the really, really interesting point. So I think we'll have a whole conversation about that, I think, probably later in the next Q&A. I'm just conscious of time. And also we had a whole bunch, but thank you so much, Andrew. I think there's so much in what you just said. And I think the whole language around how we describe growing older, aging, longevity is a massive piece of work which needs to tick off a bunch of the bigger issues like ageism and how we think about aging. So, but that's a whole other discussion, I know, a massive one. So I'm just going to spend the last few minutes just picking up on some of these very questions on the safety of rapamycin, Also, there's a question by one of the viewers. What do you think about the average 3 to 5 kilograms of weight gain put on by the average UK stay-at-home desk worker during the COVID outbreak? What will that do to life expectancy? So I know that's yes, that's probably affecting quite a lot of us. I know I had to make a huge effort to make sure that I kept that under control. But Lynne, what do you want to say about those two particular questions?
Well, I think they're pretty much linked, Tina. So rapamycin safety. Rapamycin is used in the clinic at the moment as an anti-cancer therapy and as an immune suppressant at very high doses to stop kidney transplant rejections. Now, the doses you need for anti-aging effects are much, much, much lower. So the safety profile changes with dosing. But there are some issues with rapamycin and all the first generation mTOR inhibitors for respiratory tract infections, and that's an increased incidence of pneumonitis, so inflammation within the lungs, which obviously you don't want with COVID. But the second generation mTOR inhibitors, there's drugs like RTB101 that act on the same target but with a different mechanism, are actually incredibly safe. So the Restore Bio data looked in people over 65 with comorbidities, so like cardiovascular disease and asthma, and they also looked in the frail elderly, 85 pluses, and they found, if anything, the safety profile was either the same as placebo or, if anything, better, as in fewer adverse events. So I would say that as drugs go, this is incredibly safe. To get the impact required for the anti-aging and the pro supporting the immune system, it's 1/120th of the dose that you require to actually inhibit the enzyme completely. So safety profile, great. There was another question saying, should we use drugs in a wider population? And I actually think that's an incredibly important point. I'm a biochemist, right? And I look at drugs and targets, but actually I think that the social and economic interventions are incredibly important through most of the life course. And once you start to develop the diseases of aging, or just on that cusp, at the point at very, very early on in the disease process, you might intervene with drugs. But you have to grade the response through the life course. And we pointed this out in the APPG report, that you can't, it's not one fix for everybody. So diet, education, exercise, all those interventions that we know work early on in life, through middle life, and they even work in older people. But once you've got overt disease or even covert disease, then you might have to start intervening with drugs. And then in terms of the obesity issue, sorry, 3 kilos is not obese, right? But in terms of putting weight on, adipose, particularly the adipose around the abdomen, is not good. And it's pro-inflammatory. And we also know that a strong degree of inflammation around the body is pro-aging. So there's a very strong risk that having more adipose tissue is going to create a state of chronic inflammation that drives your cells into senescence. So obesity is a driver of aging. It's a premature aging driver. So a bit of exercise and lots of fruits and vegetables and all the things your mother told you. She was right.
So interestingly, that of course we had a previous session a couple of hours ago on health prevention. What have we learned, obviously from COVID, and of course, health prevention is such an important message, just generally.
Well, I wouldn't want to prevent health. I want disease prevention.
Disease prevention, but you know what I mean. But preventative health, this is absolutely the crux of it, and we have to start even before birth. I mean, even what our mother and dad.
Absolutely.
So this is where we do have to engage young people in that whole debate. Yeah. But of course, you mentioned obesity. Of course, we know obesity needs to be cracked, and we've seen the increased deaths from diabetes and obesity. So of course, that's a massive sort of fundamental thing to crack. And hopefully it's not just the 3 kilos, but so of course that's we've heard about Boris Johnson's war on fat, and there's a lot of discussion about what we can take moving out of the crisis. What are some of the immediate things that we can tackle? So that's actually my final question. And I think they've given us a few more minutes, so it looks like we're doing a good job. They're gonna keep us going for a few more minutes, but just to finish on, what single thing coming out of COVID, bearing in mind everything that we've discussed, do you think we really need to focus on to learn the lesson of what this has taught us? So I'm going to go around. Who wants to go first?
I've got one tiny statement. It's health inequalities.
Yeah. So Lynne, you start.
Yeah, it's simply dealing with the health inequalities. That's all I've got to say about it. We've got to tackle those.
So with all the work that we've been doing and your latest thinking with all your research, what would you think that we're going to get the biggest impact by doing this? The
health resilience in the most, socioeconomically deprived areas, looking at the life expectancy already and the huge gap in health. It's not just lifespan, it's the massive and growing gap in health span, and trying to increase that so people are much more able to fend off any threat to their health, whether it be from a poor diet or exposure to pollution or infectious disease. If you have that inbuilt resilience, then you're going to be much better primed to be able to deal with health risks.
Two key things for longevity is preventative health, so you maintain your health for as long as possible, and keeping productive and engaged. And I don't just mean literally they're in work. They're the two key channels. I think Lynne, absolutely right on inequalities. I do think those two come together, because ensuring that people have a sense of purpose, a sense of engagement, and a sense of community is really crucial. And I think that's something that we're really learning from COVID. And I think that's where we need to reorientate policy towards.
Okay, Nick, final word.
Two super quick. First one is a new narrative, so we need a new language. The power of language is incredible on decisions and learning. And the second is again, it's my first point, which is intelligence. We're not sharing data. We're not knowing the same data. We are comparing apples and pears and try to think they're the same stuff. It was being crazy along the COVID. I guess it's time for shared knowledge.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more, and that's essentially where that power of AI will really come into getting a hold of that data, making intelligent use of it. Okay, well, listen, I think that's we're it's time to go. Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you. Tina, fantastic moderated session. Just that was absolutely fascinating. And everyone should have a couple of books now on their summer reading list. So please make sure that you get those in to continue the conversation further. You can join the Q&A if you're a priority pass holder at 4 p.m. on this stage. You can find that under the breakout Q&A in the chat category in your agenda. For everyone who isn't a priority pass holder, you can also continue the conversation with other audience members on the Public Knowledge Network. So make sure you do that. We've not got another session here on the stage until 5, when we've got the fantastic exponential technologies in thinking. So in the meantime, please do join the conversation on Twitter, go and meet all the exhibitors in the expo, and take a break and get yourselves ready for some more fantastic discussions later.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.